The Torah portion for this week is entitled Kedoshim, which means holy things. The root for holiness in Hebrew is kadosh or kodesh. You might actually know other words like kiddushin, which is the engagement and marriage process, or saying kaddish for someone, which is a praise of God, or making a kiddush on wine as part of a holiday celebration or Shabbat. But one of the questions that we'll be exploring through tonight's Torah portion is, what exactly does holiness mean? Both in the original Hebrew context with that root of kadash, and also in English context. This is something that's appropriate for secular and humanistic Jews to use, or maybe is it a category beyond what we think describes reality, or is it an emotional category separate from any kind of ontological supernatural reality? Now, this week, in most of the Jewish world, they're actually reading two Torah portions, one called Achrei Mot, which is the one just before this passage, and this passage of Kedoshim. I've decided to focus on just one of them because there's so much of rich material in this particular Torah portion that it's worth treating by itself. And as we'll see, we'll be talking about this question of what holiness means throughout the two chapters. We'll be looking at only two chapters, but there's a lot to explore. There's three other themes that I want to highlight in advance before we start going through the passage. And the first is one I alluded to at the beginning of the service. As we'll see, there are some marvelous passages in this Torah portion, in these two chapters of Leviticus 19 and Leviticus 20, that are very inspirational for people interested in social justice work, in charity work, in caring for those who are less fortunate, in enacting justice. There's a lot of wonderful material here. But we'll also see that there, even in the same chapter, maybe even in the very next verse, there's a passage that we would find offensive, or at least alien to us, not really relevant to what we would think of as an ethical code. If this is an ethical code, what is it doing talking about dealing with people who talk to the dead, or caring whether you plow a field with a donkey and a cow and the same yoke? Who cares? Well, as we'll see, some people would care and would define those as a question of ethics, or at least of holiness. A second theme that we'll see throughout this passage is the question of, if there is a violation of this code, how is the person to be punished? Is it a punishment that will come from heaven, the sort of proverbial lightning bolt, or maybe something that takes a little bit longer to act, like a punishment that happens on your children? And after all, is it fair for the children to be punished for what the parents have done? Well, we'll see. But maybe also there's a punishment in this life. Maybe you're shunned or expelled from the community if you violate community norms. So the question of who punishes a violation of this holy code will also come up a few times in this passage. And finally, an ultimate philosophical theme that's true in many varieties of philosophy and religious thought when it comes to ethics and behavior with others is the balance of personal freedom and conformity and group identity. The individual versus the group. What am I allowed to do? What are you allowed to tell me not to do? What are y'all allowed to tell me not to do? And on whom does the consequence fall? If I do something wrong, can we all be punished because you let me do it, or because you didn't stop me? Or am I intrinsically part of the group, and anything any one of the group does causes punishment to come down? It's like when you're teaching a classroom of 30 kids. When one of them does something wrong, does the entire class suffer? Or does only the one who did something wrong have to face the consequences? And we'll see that this applies in many ways to the laws that are prescribed here in the Torah portion of Kedoshim. So with that framework, that we're going to be exploring the topic of what holiness means, that we're going to talk about how appropriate is it to choose certain passages that we like and ignore the ones we happen not to like as source texts, the question of on what level is this punishment enacted for these kind of laws, and finally, how do we balance our personal freedom with the conformity to the group, or the idea that there's a collective consequence even if an individual violates the norm. All right, so we begin with Kedoshim, which unusually is not in the very first verse of the Torah portion. As you may recall, Most Torah portions are named after a word or a phrase within the first verse, or maybe the first verse or two. And in this case, it's several words in that we finally get the word Kedoshim, because it starts with, God spoke to Moses saying, speak to the community of Israel and say, so it's just the setup. God said, then Moses gets to say, so Moses is like the loudspeaker here. And what does he have to say to them? Kedoshim tahiyu, holy should you be. Ki kadosh ani Yahweh Elohechem, because holy am I, Yahweh, like the Zeus name of the god, Yahweh your God. Now, it doesn't clarify here what holy means. And we think of holy as a kind of supernatural quality that adheres to something. But holy also has a sense, if you take that kadash root, of being set apart, set aside. For example, a dedication in modern Hebrew in a book is a hakdashah. It's like the what's made it special. So when it means set aside, it means you're different from the others, but in a positive way. You know, it's not like you're distinguished in a negative way. You're marked, you're branded, right? No, this is more of a positive, elevated version of being set aside, different, special. So Yahweh, your God, is special. So to you as a people should be special in that way. You shall each revere your mother and your father, and keep my Shabbatot, my Sabbaths, plural, which could either be understood to mean every Shabbat through the year, or all of my holidays, my special times, right? The times I've decreed as being holy. Remember, Shabbat is described as Kodesh, as special, as opposed to the other 6 days of the week, which are just ordinary. They're not profane, they're not bad, they're just ordinary. But Shabbat is Shabbat Kodesh. It's the holy, set aside, different Shabbat. But you also notice in this verse the parallelism of daddy and mommy and God, right? Fear, and actually it says revere in the English, but in Hebrew it says tira'u, fear them, and you obey me in this similar way. There's kind of a parallelism in the verse there. So for all of the postmodern versions of God as a force, or God as the spark for good, or God as an implicit aura in the universe, this is a very parental model of a God that's telling you what to do. And just as you respect your parents, you respect your uber parent, your super parent. Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourself. I am Yahweh your God. Now you'll see a lot of these verses will end with that phrase, Ani Yahweh Elohechem, I am Yahweh your God. I sometimes draw a parallel to the Wizard of Oz, where why do they have to get the broom of the Wicked Witch of the West? I am the great and powerful Oz. You just do it because I said so. And we'll see some of these laws give a consequence, and some of the laws just say, I'm God, I told you so, because I said so. Now, lest we totally dismiss that rationale out of hand, I know plenty of parents, myself included, who occasionally have resorted to do it because I said so, because you're tired of arguing after a while. But I wouldn't say it's the pinnacle of rational parenthood to rely on that kind of authoritarian declaration. I'll also point out that when it says, do not make molten gods for yourself, or idols, even the word for idols, Elilim, seems to have the word El, God, built into it. And Elohe Masecha, the molten gods, again, they seem to be presented as if they were real beings, or at least potential conflict for God. After all, why would Yahweh be jealous of things that don't exist? But he is jealous in the way it's phrased in the Bible, and wants exclusive attention and what's called monolatry. Not just monotheism, only believing in one God, which actually hasn't appeared in Jewish life by the time this is being written, but what he wants is monolatry. Only worship one God. You're only allowed to look at, I don't want you looking at any other gods. That's the style here. So don't make the idols, because they will lead you astray. Now, when you offer a sacrifice to God, you have to sacrifice it in the right way. Remember, this is in the book of Leviticus, and the Levi'im were the tribe that was in charge of running the worship in the temple, and a sub-tribe of the Levi'im were the Kohanim, the priests, that really did the sacrifices, and the Levites who were not Kohanim were the attendants. So they're the experts who were in charge of how to sacrifice. And so you have to do it exactly the right way. Otherwise, you're in trouble. So when you give an offering of well-being, what's called a zevach shlamim, like a peace offering almost, because you have the word shalom in that shlamim, You have to eat it on the day you sacrifice it, or on Machara, and in the day after. But anything left by the third day, you have to burn it up by fire. And if you eat it on the third day, you've broken the rules. Now, why is the third day worse than the second day? I mean, we might make a sophisticated argument about, bacteria and getting sick. But honestly, it's almost an arbitrary designation, because it could get just as bad by day 2 in a world without refrigeration. But the point they're trying to make here is that the God has decreed it this way, and if you violate the decree, then you're in trouble. In fact, anyone who eats of it on the third day bears the guilt of having profaned what is kadosh, what is sacred, what is set apart for Yahweh. That person will be cut off from his kin. So here's one of the punishments I alluded to earlier. Nichrata hanefesh, the soul will be cut off. And this idea of karet, of being cut off from your people, is thought to be, by rabbinic commentary, a divine punishment. It's not something that people do. It's something that will happen over time. You won't have any kids, or the kids that you have will die, and circumstances will happen that you will simply be no longer part of your nation. Now, some other interpreters read this as a social shunning. When you're cut off from the people, it's like you're dead to us. You're no longer part of the community. It could be a temporary kind of banishment, or it could be a permanent one. So it's not entirely clear just from the original text what was originally meant when the text was written. Is this thought of as a divine punishment because it's talking about the soul being cut off? Or is this a shunning experience? Because after all, if you're cut off from people, the people are the ones cutting you off. And we don't ultimately know. And then out of nowhere, we shift to what we would consider a wonderful ethical pronouncement. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap all the way to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. So when you're harvesting with oxen and you're doing rows along the field, when you get to the corner of the field, you're going to turn, right? The oxen turn. So it's a circle. And as you know, when you cut off a square with a circle, there's going to be a corner, that's sort of a sharp corner with a rounded other side. I'm sure there's a term in geometry for what that shape is, but I don't know what it is. In any case, that corner of your field, when you turn the oxen, is what you leave. And what are the gleanings? The gleanings mean when you cut down the wheat, you're going to get most of the wheat kernels that are in the stalks, but some of them will fall on the ground. And in theory, you could send your servants back to go back over the field and pick up all the little grains that fell to the ground. But according to this, you should not do that. Do not go all the way to the edge, leave that corner of the field, and do not go back and gather the gleaning. Do not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. What do you do with those pieces? You leave them for the oni, the poor, and the ger, the stranger. Why? I am Yahweh your God. That's why. Now, again, we might make an argument of social sustenance, and you might need help at some point in your life, or compassion. That's not the reasoning given here. The reasoning given here is the commandment. But we might really like this particular ethical value, or ways that we might interpret it in our own days. So I'm curious to ask if anyone can think of an example of activities that we do, or that we could do in a community service, social service kind of direction, that might be parallels to the gleanings of the field, or the corners of the field, or the droppings of the vineyard, where we might feel like we're enacting the spirit of this law, even as we live in suburbia and don't have wheat fields and vineyards. Have you ever gone through your closets and taken off the stuff you don't wear anymore and given it to charity? It's like the gleanings of your closet, right? It's the stuff that you don't need or that you're not going to use. When you go to the grocery store, do you ever buy an extra can or two of food if there's a food drive going on? You donate that to charity. That's a kind of gleaning of your harvest from the grocery store. It's not in the fields necessarily. Or some people will even grow crops in order to donate the food in some way. I actually had a bar mitzvah student who had this Torah portion as her Torah portion, and she found a wonderful charity that was exactly in the spirit of gleaning. It was a charity called the Glass Slipper Project. And what it was designed to do was to have high school girls donate prom dresses that they didn't fit in anymore to girls also in high school or in middle school so that they could go to formal dances even if they couldn't afford a fancy dress and feel like $1 million. So it was a redistribution of prom dresses, but it was a gleaning because the ones who had it weren't using it anymore, couldn't use it anymore, and so they sort of handed it down, but it was gleaned from one and given to the other who needed the assistance. And I thought that was a great example of the principle of this passage applied in a modern context. So these are just a couple examples of how you might take this idea of gleaning and turn it into something positive in our own day. Whether you're doing it because Yahweh, your God, told you to or not, we see a positive benefit to this as a motivation for ethical action. And the ethical laws continue. I mean, again, how we would define ethical laws. Do not steal. Do not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. So be honest. Do not swear falsely by God's name. So the idea of taking the name in vain, we think of as like, being profane, swearing, God damn it. Well, in this case, it really literally in the Hebrew says l'shakir, to lie. So swearing by the name, but to take a false oath, which again, we would find a positive value to avoid lying or to swear something falsely. Now he says by swearing falsely, it's chilal, it's a profanation of the holy name. And, the idea of profaning the holy name, we're not as concerned about because again, the ontological reality of a God who cares whether you say his name or not is something we're willing to doubt. But the idea of being honest, again, is something that we could transpose into a secular key and still have it be a positive value. In verse 13, you will not defraud your fellow Israelite. You will not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer will not stay with you until the morning. And that last verse I really love. Actually, the word order is interesting. It says, lo talin peulat sachir. So do not let stay overnight the wages of the worker until the morning. What this means is if somebody works for you that day, pay them that day. Don't withhold the wages. Don't force them to come back to you the next day so they have to work for you just to get the money you already owe them from the day before. You have to pay them promptly. This is what today we'd call wage theft, right? Where the owners hold on to the wages the workers have earned to force the workers to come back. Or think about the sharecropping system in the aftermath of the Civil War, which tied African Americans in the South to a kind of debt slavery on the land in perpetuity. So the wages of the laborer do not stay with you until the morning. I love that ethic at any time period. Verse 14, you will not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Now here we get a reason. Why not insult the deaf? Because they can't hear you anyways. Or put a stumbling block in front of the blind to watch them trip? Well, because God's watching. Even if the deaf can't hear you, God hears you, and he knows what you've done, and he knows if you've been sleeping, and he knows if you're awake, so you need to be careful. So, and again, notice the word to fear your God, just like you were supposed to fear your parents. When people say it's an awesome God, sometimes it's a scary God, but it's a real God and a powerful God that intervenes in the world, according to Leviticus. Now, when we're making ethical decisions, we do it for other reasons, not because we're afraid of the lightning bolt or even an ultimate long-term consequence from a supernatural source. Our ethics come from the consequences or from the offense to human dignity that it offers to the people who cannot hear you or those of disabilities who are unable to succeed. In fact, I had another bat mitzvah student who used this particular verse as a jumping off point for a wonderful bat mitzvah project on disability inclusion and universal design and all kinds of aspects of responding to disabilities, not by mocking and not by adding difficulties to their difficulties, but by enabling them to feel part of the full community. So again, a wonderful spark for positive humanistic ethical action, even if it's phrased in Leviticus as a divine decree because God is watching and will get you if you're doing it wrong. You will not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. You judge your kin fairly. But tzedek tishpot amitecha. So in justice or in righteousness, in equality. Now, this is really interesting because we would think that in an ancient time period, of course, everyone's going to favor the rich, right? Or frankly, in our own day, of course, everyone's going to favor the rich. But here it's saying, don't favor the poor either. You don't assume just because they are less wealthy, less well off, that they are in the right in bringing a legal case. They could be wrong too. You really have to be fair no matter who they are. This is an interesting challenge in our legal system and in our social discourse, because depending on which side of the political aisle you're on, you may sympathize with the poor and assume that they are in the right. But the point here is the question of right or wrong is not a function of who you're dealing with. It's what they've done. Again, this verse on its own sounds great. You know, the idea of a blind justice. And do not deal basely with members of your people. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow Israelites. The phrase in Hebrew, lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by next to or on the blood of your neighbor. If something is happening that's to someone near you that is terrible, that they're suffering, that they're on the point of dying, do something. Don't stand by. Do something. Intervene. Again, Ani Yahweh, I am your God. Fine. One of our strategies when we read these texts as humanistic Jews is to understand that just because it said God said so, doesn't mean that a God actually said so. It just means that a person said that God said so. So we're able to filter the God said part and understand that this was something that a person wrote, believing that a God would want this, but in the end, it was a human creation. And that's why these ethics are still inspirational to us. But as we'll see, not all of the verses in this passage are so positive. Again, here's a good one. Do not hate your kinfolk in your heart. So don't be jealous. Don't bear resentment against each other. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. What this means is talk to them. If they're doing something wrong, don't let them go on doing it wrong. But notice the reasoning given here is one where we might begin to question this idea of a collective consequence. Because why would you be guilty if they're doing it wrong? I mean, if you're aiding and abetting, okay. If you're a bystander, maybe you should have done something, but in the end, you weren't actively intervening. But here it's saying if you stand by and let it happen and let them do wrong, you might still be guilty because of this idea of collective responsibility and collective consequence. Again, we can think of examples from the Holocaust. We had a program just a few weeks ago on how to be righteous, talking about the righteous Gentiles who intervened to save Jews during the Holocaust. They were people who intervened. We can think of other examples in our own life of times that we will bear the consequence if our neighbor is doing something wrong, whether or not it's our fault. And so maybe it does behoove us in a self-interested way to intervene and tell them to stop. But the idea of incurring a cosmic guilt because of something they do might be something that we would question. Do not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your neighbor as yourself. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Very famous line. Again, why do it? I'm your God. Okay. But who is your neighbor? Is your neighbor simply the person whom you live next to? Is your neighbor the person of your community? Notice the translation here has love your fellow Israelite as yourself. So is your orbit of moral concern simply the people you know or the people in your community? Or are you like Mr. Rogers and you say to anybody, won't you be my neighbor? I mean, are you welcoming anybody into this orbit of concern? Or is it simply that you're focused on b'nei amecha, the children of your people, of your nation, the members of your group? Well, this is again that question of universalism versus particularism that we've talked about many times. As humanistic Jews, we have a foot in both worlds, and sometimes it's hard to only focus on one or the other. In this case, we might take this neighbor question and expand it to something more broadly than simply our own community. And now in verse 19, it shifts from love your neighbor as yourself to observe my laws. You will not let your cattle mate with a different kind. You will not sow your field with two kinds of seed. You will not put on cloth from a mixture of two kinds of material. So a cotton poly blend that violates the rule. Now, what does this have to do with ethics? Well, a couple of thoughts. The first is, remember, this is a set of rules built around the idea of kadosh, holiness, what is set apart. And so the cattle and the other animals should be set apart. The two kinds of seed should be set apart. The two kinds of material should be made apart. So you keep things separate that should stay separate. That's part of the holiness. So we might see this as, overly concerned, picky, or, ridiculously detailed, where they would say this is part of the general pronouncement of keeping things separate that belong separate. The other idea of ethics that relates to this is the idea of authoritarian ethics, or you obey the laws because they're the laws. You don't ask questions, you simply do. And in an authoritarian law setup, if the authority is legitimate, then the laws they pronounce should be followed. So the fact that Yahweh says, because I said so, is enough to do this. It's in fact a test. If you want to truly be ethical, you are fulfilling mitzvot, commandments. Now, we think of mitzvah as good deed, and that can go beyond the traditional categories of rabbinic pronouncement. But in the traditional Orthodox, or even historically Jewish, before there was Orthodoxy setting, the idea was you followed the commandments because they're commanded. Maimonides, who made a whole list of reasons for the commandments, in some cases would say, this is a law as a test to see if you'll follow the rules. You'll get reward from God from following it, but there's no reason we can see behind this. You just have to do it because that's what it says. And doing the commandment is ethical because you're obeying the legitimate authority. Now, our style of ethics, being more consequentialist, asks what's going to happen to people if I do this or don't do this, and that can decide whether it's ethical or not, or simply indifferent. If I wear a blue shirt or a white shirt, is that really different one way or the other ethically? No. Maybe how the shirt was made has an ethical implication, but the color wouldn't matter. So here's a case where it feels like they're telling us what color shirt to wear, and what business is that of theirs from our ethical perspective. But from the traditional mind, this is a command system where you follow the rules that are commanded. And here's another example that we might find not just irrelevant, but actually offensive.
I have a question, Adam.
Yes, please.
On that last one that you did, is there any practical reason why, for example, two kinds of seeds should not be sown? Is there something practical behind this that makes a difference for an agricultural society, for example? And I was struck by the seeds.
Well, you could argue it's easier to harvest a field where they're all the same thing because you're doing the same action every time instead of going high and low to find the ripe fruit or vegetable. I don't know that it has anything to do.
Basically, you're saying this is like the kind. It's I said so and just do it. It's not because some of the laws have a practical background to them. The mixing of milk with and so on and.
Well, I don't know. I've eaten cheeseburgers my whole life and not had any negative consequences. So.
Yeah, okay. So I'm just saying that in some cases there are practical reasons, and I guess, and maybe I thought there was something, especially about the two kinds of seeds. I thought there was something practical about that.
Well, look, remember that it's actually helpful sometimes for nitrogen fixation and other processes of enlivening a field to mix what you're harvesting by year, right? You rotate the crops and then it helps the soil last better. That's not planting at the same time. I'll be honest, I'm not a farmer. I don't know if it's better or not to have two seeds. I'm thinking just practically it'd be a lot easier if it's all one field of the same thing. And every farm I've ever visited, I think, does it that way. I don't think they mix soybeans and corn in the same field. That might be just practically problematic. But so maybe you make the argument about the seeds, but what's the deal about the cloth from two different kinds of material? who cares if it's linen and wool in the same clothing, if it washes okay, and if it dyes okay? So there's an element of this that is focused on the theology and the ideology more than a practical example of human wisdom. And so where the line is drawn between practical wisdom and theological imposition on the world, that's hard to draw. But I will say there's a whole industry of Orthodox apologetics that will go through every one of these and try to prove to you it's exactly the right thing to do for all those kind of reasons. But of course, they know the answer, which is, yes, this is the right thing to do. And so they're trying to prove it, as opposed to exploring, is this really better to do this or not? And honestly, so let's say your cattle mates with another kind of species, and it produces an offspring that's sterile. When you have a horse and a donkey that mate, you get a mule, which is sterile and can't reproduce. But is that like a moral violation to allow that to happen and to produce? No. They would find it a theological violation to allow the two different species to mate and to produce something that's not, but I wouldn't call that a moral failing. Let the mule be a mule. So now we get one that really is a question of a moral failing, or what we would call a moral failing in the text. If a man has carnal relations with a woman who is a slave and has been designated for another man, but has not been redeemed or given her freedom, there will be an indemnity. They will not be put to death since she was not freed. So let me explain what's happening here. A woman is a slave, and her owner has appointed someone who will marry her. Didn't ask, didn't, put her on a dating website for her to find her own match. He's appointed someone to marry her. So she's designated, she's kadosh, she's designated for someone else. And then another man shows up and sleeps with her, basically. It's the phrase in Hebrew is actually shichvat zera. He lies down with seed with her. So we know what that means. Now, this woman could have been redeemed and given her freedom. And if she had been freed, notice, they would have been put to death. But because she's still a slave and thus the property of her owner, he owes compensation to the owner and to God for having broken the taboos. He must bring to the entrance of the tent of meeting a guilt offering, a ram of a guilt offering. And the priest makes atonement for him for the sin he committed, and the sin is forgiven. So he has to pay off the owner. But what about the woman? Whether she liked him or not, whether it was consensual or not, we just don't know. And any damage that's done is paid to the owner of the woman, not the woman has no agency here. So the whole framework of this is blech. And then it switches back to a law of agriculture. So again, not any way that we would sort of structure these laws. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you regard the fruit as forbidden. Now, the Hebrew is really fascinating because it basically says you will not take the foreskin of the tree as fruit. Literally using the word for foreskin in Hebrew. But the idea is that for 3 years, you're not allowed to eat from the tree. And in the 4th year, all the fruit is set aside as kadosh. Again, you see this word here. It's kodesh. It is set aside for Yahweh. And only in the 5th year do you eat its fruit, and its yield is increased. Now, I'll ask you a quiz question. How do you tell how old a tree is while it's alive? Now, we know you can cut it down and count the rings, but that's not going to help you get the fruit, right? So how do you know how old, how do you keep track of trees' birthdays? Well, there is actually a holiday in the Jewish calendar designed to track the trees' birthdays. It's called Tu B'Shvat, which is the new year for trees. So just like every horse in the world, his birthday is January 1st, they're a year older. The same is true for trees. On Tu B'Shvat, they're a year older. So you track the years of the trees by the new year for trees. That's the tree birthday. And so you do not eat the fruit in the first few years, you eat it in the 5th year. This is also part of a pattern we see in other areas where the fertility is a deal you make with the god. The first fertility belongs to the god, and later fertility belongs to you. It applies to animals. At some point in Jewish history, it might have even applied to children, but it certainly applies to fruits and to produce. Some of it has to be offered to God, and often the first fruits, the first lambs, those are the sacrifices to the god in exchange for the promise of fertility going further. You will not eat anything with its blood. Lo tochlu al hadam, do not eat blood. Now, if only all those anti-Semitic rumors about Jews and matzah had read this one verse in the Bible. Kosher laws have an anathema for blood. You slaughter the animal in a way to drain as much blood as possible. You then salt the meat to absorb as much blood as possible. If you're baking with eggs, you break the eggs in a separate bowl to make sure there's no blood spot. There's a horror of eating blood. And yet this anti-Semitic rumor, based on an idea that the Jews were the devil's people and they had the devil's wafer, meant that the Jews used Christian blood to make their matzah. Well, again, we know that anti-Semitism is on some level a hallucination of something that never happened, and this is one of those cases. Because if they'd read this verse, they would have known blood was anathema, or else they would have said the Jews are breaking their own laws, so they're hypocrites as well as evil. You know, again, if you've decided you hate someone, you'll find the answer you want. And then it also says, make sure you do not practice divination or soothsaying, because prophecy, that's good. That comes from the God. But divination and soothsaying, that's black magic. That's trying to manipulate the supernatural for yourself. Don't do that. So just as God is a jealous God, God is a monopolistic God. You want supernatural information, you only have one source. GNN. You men shall not round off the side growth on your head or destroy the side growth of your beard. In the Hebrew, it says, Lo takifu pe'at roshchem, the pe'at, the corner of your head. But if you were reading this with a Yiddish accent, pe'at would be payas. Have you ever heard of payas? That's the side curls that you'll see on some Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox men. And it comes from this word here, pe'at or payas is the word for those side curls, coming from this commandment to not round the corners of your head. This is often taken as a principle of don't be like the other nations around you who do this kind of change. Now, is your hairstyle an ethical decision? I wouldn't think so. Is it a social conformity decision? Absolutely. Right? I mean, just look at the battles that we have over gender roles and gender identity that are happening now, over what kind of haircut ones have, what kind of clothing one wears. You know, social conformity and hairstyle is a deeply rooted phenomenon. And this is just one more example. Again, we wouldn't call it ethical, but they would call it ethical by following the commandment and by being part of the communal norms. And if you break the communal norms, that's a big deal. In fact, if you read memoirs of people who've left ultra-Orthodoxy, getting their payas cut off to look like the surrounding world is often a very big transition, break with the community moment for them, because you can't go back. You know, they've seen that you've cut them and you have to hide for 3 months for it to grow back long enough so they won't know. You know, once you've done that, you can't go back. People who have payas sometimes tuck them behind their ears so you can't really see it, or wear a baseball cap. But once you've cut it, that's a red line and you can't go back. It also points out, just like the not practicing what the other people have done, do not make gashes in your flesh for the dead, cut your skin for the dead, or incise any marks on yourself. Think tattoos. Tattoo is taboo in this practice. Now, I will point out, in case anybody asks, yes, you can get buried in a Jewish cemetery with tattoos. this certainly was changed after the Holocaust, when you had lots of people with tattoos who didn't choose to get them, who deserved to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. But it also happened even before the war, because they realized that tattooing was not to worship other gods. It was art. It was whatever. It still wasn't accepted. You know, your Bobby, your grandma would have been appalled to see the tattoo that you got, but it doesn't matter. It wouldn't have disqualified you from the Jewish cemetery. So if anybody thinks that's still the rule, it's not the rule. So don't worry about it. Do not degrade your daughter and make her a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry and the land be filled with depravity. Finally, we've got a consequential rule here. Why don't you want your daughter to be a loose woman? Because the land will become filled with depravity. It's going to snowball. And it'll be anarchy and Sodom and Gomorrah all over again. Keep my Sabbaths, venerate my sanctuary, keep what's holy, holy, and do not turn to ghosts or require of familiar spirits to be defiled by them. Again, the monopoly of God. Interesting that the familiar spirits is ovot, which is almost written the same word as the word av, or father, the ancestral spirits. So you get the idea of a marketplace of ideas here, or a competition of ideas between those necromancers and people that would talk to the dead as a source of supernatural authority, and the priests who want you to only talk to the one God through the one people who are authorized to run the priestly show. And then right after the ghosts and familiar spirits, rise before the aged, show deference to the old. That's a good value. That's a pragmatic value, because they have wisdom and knowledge and social capital. When strangers reside with you in your land, do not wrong them. The stranger who lives with you will be as one of your citizens, and you will love each other as yourself. Love each one of those strangers as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is one of the best laws in the Torah. Remember that who is your neighbor, and you should love your neighbor as yourself? Well, now your neighbor is anybody. Love the stranger, not just the neighbor. Love the stranger. Of course, it depends how you translate the word ger, because sometimes the word ger means stranger. In Rabbinic Judaism, it was translated as convert. So when it says love the convert as yourself, that's an in-group thing. When it's love the stranger, it's universal. So it all depends on how you interpret it. And that's really the theme of this chapter from our perspective. Do not falsify measures of length and weight. Have equal measures. Great, wonderful. Have an honest balance, no commercial cheating. And then observe all my laws and all my rules. Why? I am Yahweh. The great and powerful Yahweh has spoken. So you've seen just in chapter 19, a wonderful collection of good, positive ethics and values that we would take seriously, other principles that could be applied in positive ways to our life, some details that are seemingly irrelevant to what we would consider ethical, and other details that we might find actually positively unethical. So let me ask you, is it legitimate to quote, love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger as yourself because you were strangers, and use it to justify advocacy for immigrant rights or for toleration of difference, when you're totally ignoring the mixing linen and wool together rules and actively resisting the slavery rule that's involved here? Is it fair to quote one verse and ignore the verse next to it? Or do you feel it's legitimate to find inspiration and common cause, even in sources where the whole body of the source might be objectionable? So I'm curious what you think about that.
So you're asking Ibsen's Reverend Brand's question, is it all or nothing?
Well, that's part of it. What do you think?
Is not Reform Judaism built on the idea that some of the things in Scripture are things we take and some aren't? It's almost like a shopping market of I'll have that, I'll have two of these and none of those, thank you.
You know, it's funny you mentioned Reform Judaism. This is actually part of the Yom Kippur liturgy, this chapter in Reform congregations. They've replaced Leviticus 18, which is the traditional reading, with the reading of Leviticus 19 instead, because they like it better. Because Leviticus 18 is a lot like Leviticus 20, which we'll see in just a minute, much more objectionable. But they're comfortable quoting parts and not worrying about the other parts as much. Why don't we just do that? To me, it feels a little bit dishonest, as if I'm saying, I do what my tradition tells me, and my tradition says, love the stranger, and that's why I'm loving the stranger. That's not why I'm loving the stranger. I'm loving the stranger because I think it's good for them, and it's good for me, and it's good for society, and it's respecting their dignity as people. Because there's plenty of things that my tradition tells me to do that I don't do. So I'm not only doing it because the tradition tells me to, and on the other hand, I do like the fact that my tradition over 2,500 years ago came up with the idea that you should pay the worker the same day. I like that. I get a sense of ethical roots, a sense of continuity between my values and my people's values. So I'm torn. I don't want to feel inauthentic by quoting the text as if the text defines what's right and wrong when it doesn't. But I like finding sources that go back a long way that reflect the values that I find important. I sometimes describe my Jewish values like a Venn diagram, like overlapping circles. So there's traditional Jewish values and there's my values, and sometimes they overlap. But it's when my values overlap with traditional ones that I can quote something. But there are plenty of times when my values say, respect all lifestyles and sexual identities. And Leviticus does not, as we will see right now. So in Leviticus 20, which we'll go through a little bit faster than 19, first it says that anyone among the Israelites who gives a child to Moloch, who practices child sacrifice, they should be stoned to death with stones. So this is a human enforced consequence. I will set my face against that party, who I cut off from among the people for having done so. So the people stone them with stones, and God will punish them in their own. So they get a double punishment from God and from the people. And if the people of the land should shut their eyes and should not put the person to death, then that person is also guilty, and they'll be cut off by God. So this is the case where if you see someone doing this, you're guilty too, for not being the first one to cast the stone, so to speak, and intervening. And if anyone turns to ghosts and familiar spirits, that person is cut off. You will sanctify yourself and be holy, set apart, different from the other peoples in the land, and you have to observe the laws that will make you holy, that I, God, Yahweh, have set yourself apart, have sanctified you for me. If anybody insults their father or mother, they are put to death, and they will retain the blood guilt that carries on with their line. Now, putting your kid to death for an insult, well, maybe a little harsh. We like the idea. Certainly, we parents like the idea of not letting kids insult us, but maybe this is a little strong. If a man commits adultery with a married woman, adultery with another man's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. So this is, again, very strict lines of holiness, right? Set apart. The bride has undergone what's called Kedoshim, sanctification, being set apart for the groom. And so anyone who breaks that bond, who interferes in the set-asideness, is a violator. And in fact, both the adulterer and the adulteress are put to death. If a man lies with his father's wife, it is the nakedness of the father he has uncovered. Now, this could be his mother, or it could be his stepmother, or his, because remember, polygamy was accepted in biblical times. So you could have a man with 2 or 3 wives. And so your father's wife might not be your biological mother, but be a stepmother. But that is both of them being put to death. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, they're both put to death. And then here's verse 13. If a man lies with a male as one lies with a woman, the 2 of them have done an abhorrent thing. They shall be put to death, and the blood guilt continues in their lines. Now, this is the basis for a lot of the evangelical Christian and Orthodox Jewish objection to recognizing same-sex marriage and same-sex partnerships. Although some sources have noted that because it says a man with a man, that lesbianism or two women together is a different category of violation. It's thought as being a more minor sin, like eating bread on Passover, where this is a major sin with cosmic consequences. But either way, calling people living out their personal attractions a sin is itself, we would say, a violation. So when you read this in chapter 20, verse 13, it's hard to go back and cite chapter 19 and say, oh, this is all wonderful, this holiness code. This is part of the Holiness Code too. What should be separate should be separate. If a man takes a woman and her mother into his household, it's a depravity. Both he and they shall be put to the fire. If a man has carnal relations with a beast, he shall be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. Why the animal? One of the commentators said it was a temptation. Like it was, the animal was asking for it. I don't know. But again, it has violated the boundary, therefore it needs to be prescribed. If a woman approaches a beast to mate with it, kill the woman and the beast. If a man takes his sister into his household, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and sees her nakedness and she sees his nakedness, they shall be expelled, cut off. That's the karet violation in the sight of their kinfolk, and he bears the guilt. If a man lies with a woman during her menstrual condition and uncovers her nakedness, lays bare her flow, and she exposed the source of her blood, they will be cut off from among the people. So this is the menstrual, what's called nidah precautions of not being close together, in rabbinic practice, not even touching the same bed. They have separate beds like Lucy and Desi Arnaz and I Love Lucy, because they simply can't be on the same bed during that time period, unless something happened. Males do not uncover the nakedness of your... There's a lot of obsession here with nakedness, isn't there? And family violation and sexual impurity. This is part of that complex that many traditional religions produce in people of either sex obsession or sex aversion because of all the forbiddens. You are not allowed, you shall not, you shall not. And it goes on. And finally, at the end, starting in verse 22, you will faithfully observe all my laws and regulations, lest the land I bring you to will vomit you out. Literally has the word vomit in there, will spew you out. So here's the consequence. If you break my laws and do what the other nations do, which is all this impure sexual stuff, then you will be expelled. Do not follow the practice of the nations I'm driving out before you. They did all these things. And I told you, you possess their land. I will give it to you. Eretz zavat chalav udavash, a land flowing with milk and honey. I, your God, have set you apart. Hivdalti, I have distinguished you, just like Havdalah at the end of Shabbat. I've distinguished you. You are the holy. You are the Shabbat. They are the ordinary. They are the rest of the week, the prosaic. I've set you apart from all the other nations. And so you too will set apart the pure beast from the impure bird from the pure bird. Do not draw abominations on yourself, because I have set you to know the difference between tahor, pure, and tameh, impure. You will be holy to me, for I am holy, and I have set you apart. Avdil, I have distinguished you from all the other peoples to mine, to be mine. So when people talk about the Jews as a chosen people, today that sounds chauvinistic. It sounds egotistical. It sounds offensive. And so it's been reframed by interpretation as a special people, like all peoples are special, or chosen for a special mission, or chosen for special obligations and requirements. So no, we don't think we're better than anybody else. But then you read Leviticus 20, and it says, I, the one God, as we understand it, the holy God, have made you holy like me. I am different than everything else, and you are different from everyone else. And generally, holy is thought to be in a good way, not just in a neutral way. And we might argue that any kind of claim to being special, better than everybody else, the one people of the one true God, is itself an unethical thing to say. So if holiness is the idea of treating something as special, It's okay to treat your family as special, as set aside for you. They're your family. It might be okay to, at times, have more concern for your fellow citizens or your ethnic group or your particular subgroup of humanity, more so than all humanity as a whole. That can be legitimate. But there are times where chauvinism is crossing the line. I've often joked that I don't need to receive a Father's Day card that says world's #1 dad. First of all, I always question the data set. How many fathers have you actually had that you have any basis of deciding I'm #1? I don't need to be #1. But you're a great dad. You're the best dad I've ever had. Those are true statements. And I'm fine with that. So being special is one thing. Being unique, set aside, being better than others, I've chosen you from all the peoples, that's a step too far. So when it comes to the Holiness Code, I find it valuable in its episodes, but always to be qualified. And if I do quote a source, like Leviticus 19, I almost always will say, now we know that the rest of Leviticus might not be as nice. So at least people know that I know what I'm doing, which is choosing what's valuable and ethical to me. Sometimes pick and choose is fine. Any last thoughts, comments, or questions before we wrap up for tonight? And I've gone on for quite a while, but again, it was only 2 chapters and such a meaty portion.
Is there a thought that chapter 20 was written long after chapter 19?
Well, different scholars chop up the book differently when they're trying to reconstruct who wrote what and when. I'll point out that the last verse in chapter 20 talks again about the ghosts and familiar spirits that we saw referenced in chapter 19. So it may well be that that is a sort of concise body, those 2 chapters together, that show a unity of content and purpose. I mean, honestly, the themes are very consistent between the 2. The use of God language is consistent between the 2. The vocabulary seems consistent. So I don't know that there would be many scholars who would argue that they're from 2 different sources from 2 different time periods. I think they're more likely to think that they're consistent with one source.
Well, if with all the stuff that goes on today, you can see how dangerous whoever wrote this didn't think of what the consequences were for the future, because we're in a mess because the evangelicals and a lot of people use these chapters to justify their belief system.
Right. Well, Leviticus 18 also, which we didn't look at today because it's in the other Torah portion, has just as many of these condemnations of homosexuality and bestiality and other things in the same vocabulary as this. And you're right, it's appalling. But the author of this, honestly, probably didn't have that much sympathy for gay people. That wasn't part of their animating sense of ethics and values. So sometimes we have to admit the discontinuity to say, I'm Jewish, but this historic Jewish value is not mine. And I find it's more honest to admit when we disagree than to try to pretend like we agree with everything. And I'm just going to skip over these 6 inconvenient verses that don't match what I think. I'd rather say, I like this part, I don't like this part, and here's why. And I'm willing to admit when I don't agree. It actually gives me more credibility when I do agree, if I'm willing to admit when I don't.